Good afternoon, everyone in European countries who is with us in this online panel. A late afternoon for those in Israel and Palestine, and a very early afternoon for those in the US. A very warm welcome to all of you and many thanks for your interest. My name is Jörn Böhme. I am on the board of the New Israel Fund Germany. The New Israel Fund Germany is an affiliate of the New Israel Fund, founded in 1979 in the US. The New Israel Fund has affiliates in Switzerland, Great Britain, Canada, and Australia, and since 2014 also in Germany. NIF supports civil society organizations in Israel which fight for democracy and the rule of law, for religious tolerance and pluralism, and for more social and economic equality in Israel's society. I myself worked for many years as a senior advisor on North Africa and the Middle East in the parliamentary group of the Green Party in the German parliament. And from 2006 till 2010, I was the director of the Israel office of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Tel Aviv. We want to deal with the background and the prospects of Israeli annexation of Palestinian territories in the coming hour. The issue has been catapulted to the forefront of the political debate on Israel-Palestine since the publication of the so-called Deal of the Century at the end of January of this year, which is actually an American-Israeli plan. The controversy about this plan is highlighted, for example, in the title of the newest issue of the Palestine-Israel Journal. The title reads as follows: Steal of the Century. This brings us directly to all the questions around the prospects of Israeli annexation of Palestinian land. We have two distinguished guests who will help us with analyses and assessments to better understand this issue and everything connected to it. It was not easy to get them since, as legal activists, they are both very involved in the current developments. Therefore, I would like to welcome both of them all the more. Sawsan Zaher in Haifa and Michael Sfard in Tel Aviv. Sawsan is a lawyer and since November 2018, the Deputy General Director of Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. She studied law in the US. After working in a private law office, she established and directed the legal department in Kayan, feminist organization in Haifa. In 2012, the Israeli magazine The Marker named Sawsan Zaher as one of the 40 promising people under the age of 40 in her field of expertise. Michael Sfard is one of Israel's leading human rights lawyers. He studied in Jerusalem and London. After his army service in a later reservist session, he became a conscientious objector and spent 3 weeks in military prison due to his refusal to serve as escort for Israeli settlers in Hebron. Sfard has represented a variety of Israeli and Palestinian human rights and peace organizations, movements, and activists, among them Yesh Din and Peace Now. He received the Emil Grünzweig Human Rights Award, and his writings on human rights have appeared in the New York Times, Haaretz, The Independent, and Foreign Policy. Again, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your precious time. Please allow me to dedicate this hour and this discussion to the memory of Professor Zeev Sternhell, political scientist and a prominent figure on the Israeli left who died last Sunday at the age of 85. Born in Poland and himself a victim of the Nazis and fascism, he became a world-renowned expert on the study of fascism, radical nationalism, and the fight against the counter-forces to enlightenment. For many years, he expressed his views against occupation, against the settlements, against the radical right, and warned of the prospects of the collapse of Israeli democracy. His teachings, his writings, and his personality will be missed very much. It is good to know that you, Michael, spoke at his funeral and that his daughter Yael is on the board of the New Israel Fund. I would like to give each of you 5 to 8 minutes for introductory remarks. After that, we will have time for discussion and additional questions that were sent to us by members of the audience. Sawsan, I would like to start with you and ask you to also address in your remarks an assessment by your organization Adalah concerning the recent decision by the Israeli Supreme Court to cancel the, quote, settlement regularization law for Judea and Samaria, end of quote. This law was supposed to allow the state of Israel to expropriate privately owned Palestinian land in the West Bank and to retroactively legalize the Israeli settlements built on it. In an assessment of this verdict, Adalah writes that, quote, it is expected that the ruling will have implications for annexation planned through Israeli legislation, end of quote. Please elaborate on this. The floor is yours. You have to put your microphone on.
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm always happy to speak in events for the NIF, especially if it's together with my colleague, my favorite colleague, Michael. And I'm clearly not anymore beneath the age of 40, so I'm totally beyond that. Read my bio. Anyway, I know of how the validation would affect the annexation issue. On the one hand, we can say that it might have an effect, but on the other hand, the answer might not be that clear, because the Supreme Court, when it cancelled or annulled this law, it basically reasoned its decision on the fact, not on the Israeli law, but on the laws of occupation, the IHL, where it also made a clear distinction between the rights of Palestinians as protected civilians under the laws of occupation and the status and the rights of the Jews in the illegal settlement. And where it said that this law would basically result in the violation of the right to equality, the right to dignity, and the right to property of Palestinians as protected civilians under laws of occupation and IHL, this basically means that the court recognizes the special, unique, and different status of the Palestinians. It also didn't make a clear decision on the applicability of the Israeli law on the West Bank, and also personally on Palestinians in the West Bank. So this would also raise a huge question on whether annexation, if it will be done by a law, and whether it will reach this law, the challenging of the annexation law would reach the Supreme Court. The question is, would the Supreme Court view the reasoning in the same way that it viewed the reasoning in the validation law? Would it annul it again? Would it see as well that, again, the right to equality of the Palestinians has been breached? Because on the one, like, it cannot provide, or like the Supreme Court will not be able basically to have a different stand when challenging the annexation law, and says that the right to property and equality and dignity in challenging the annexation plan are not recognized, but when challenging the validation law, it is basically recognized. It will be a huge contradiction between in what the Supreme Court said in the validation law. So this basically can provide a positive thing towards towards not having a law, because it might lead basically to its annulment by the Israeli Supreme Court. However, on the other hand, if the government will see that the validation court decision puts an obstacle, it doesn't matter in what rate, in what portion, to the annexation, it probably would do it in a way of a basic law, which would be part of Israel's unwritten constitution, and it would lead to putting more difficulty on the intervention by a court in order to provide legitimacy for this annexation. So this is on the one hand. So this is on the one hand. On the other hand, I think that we also should look at the stand of the Attorney General when he is agreeing to the annexation, because annexation basically means having the Israeli sovereignty applicable on the West Bank, which is an occupied territory. First of all, such a stand is, of course, illegal based on international law, where we all know that annexing property and land in a territory that is not under your sovereignty is a war crime and is illegal based on IHL. This is the first thing. So the Attorney General would basically support another illegal step by the government, which also is being opposed in one way or another by the international community. But it also has an effect towards the issue that is now in front of the ICC. Because on the one hand, in the ICC, in the Attorney General's opinion that was submitted before the prosecutor at the ICC, the Attorney General was clear in saying that what matters is that it's a political question, and what matters is the bilateral agreements. What matters is the Oslo agreement, and anything that should be solved on a political level between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So that was before the ICC. On the contrary, when the Attorney General agrees and supports the illegal annexation and the application of Israeli law on the West Bank, this clearly says that the issue now for him is not political, but it is legal, it is constitutional, and suddenly from his perspective has legitimacy. So these issues, like what's going to happen after the 1st of July, if it will happen. And of course, as we all know, a lot of things would be more clearer, and our stand would be more clearer when we know more about the details of the annexation plan in terms of applicability on which territory exactly, applicability in terms of like the scope, what will happen as well with not only the annexation of land, but also what will happen with the status of the Palestinians who will be in the territory that will be annexed. And I think that the status of the Palestinians is another important component, not less important than the issue of land and the control of land through annexation. Because if we will make an analogy in Israel's policy in 1948 in the Green Line, land and demography has all the time been the most important components in order to preserve Israel as a Jewish state. Without land, you don't have the state. And without demography, Jewish majority, you don't have a Jewish state. So land and demography were always the most important things. And these also were reflected in decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court in different aspects that were related to the Palestinian citizens' rights inside of Israel. Now, in an analogy with that, if we look at the annexation, we also see that it's land again in order to annex and basically achieve Netanyahu's dream in having Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, rather than staying in the state of Israel. So land is another important component, but also the demography, which is reflected, but by what kind of status the Palestinians will have after the annexation. Now, this is not just important in the way of how Israel sees it, but it's also important from the Palestinian side, because it will affect the Palestinians in terms of their ability to realize their right to self-determination as a people, first of all, and second of all, as individuals, because based on international law and how it developed throughout the years until today, the right of self-determination is not only the right to have a state, which would basically be blocked by the annexation. The annexation will block any kind of having the ability for Palestine to declare a state in the territory of 1967. But it will also, has another aspect of the right of individuals to determine their own destiny based in terms of their ability to realize their own basic needs and their own basic rights. And if they will not be, and it depends, of course, on Israel's decision on what status they will give them, which probably, based on Netanyahu's statements recently, they will not be granted a citizenship or any permanent status. This means that there will be a preservation of the classification between Palestinians, so that they will be, on the one hand, under Israeli sovereignty. Israeli law will apply on them, but on the other hand, they have no status in the territory that they will be annexed to, not to, of course, mention that they will have no ability to decide on their own destiny, whether it is deciding through voting to the parliament, whether it's deciding issues that are related to economic rights, social rights, health rights, and name it whatever. Of course, what I'm saying doesn't say that the Palestinians do want to have status, but this is a huge issue that we need to look upon, because of course we all know that the Palestinians are opposing and will continue to oppose the annexation in all its forms. But again, the implication of it in terms of the status of Palestinians will be an important issue to analyze later.
Okay, thank you very much, Sawsan. Michael, maybe you also want to comment on this decision of the Supreme Court, because you were also involved in challenging this law. But allow me to also interject another short question that I would like you to address. You wrote an article recently in Haaretz where you said the claim that annexation will not change anything since in any event there's de facto annexation, and you say this is a dangerous misconception leading to quiet support for annexation in order to remove the masks. And maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit also in your answer. Please.
Thank you very much, Jörn, and thank you for having me and inviting me, and it's a pleasure being with this audience of NIF and with Sawsan, my dear friend. Yeah, I mean, one of the most dangerous misconceptions that is circulating around is that annexation might be important politically, might be important symbolically, it might have implications in the realm of international law, a violation of international law, but for the people on the ground, it will not change anything, because Israel has been dominating, occupying this territory for 53 years, and whatever breach of rights it wanted to commit towards Palestinians, it has done so, it will continue to do so. And basically the annexation would not change that. And that is a grave misconception, because annexation will provide Israel with some tools that is not at its disposal today. And one of those tools is exactly a tool that was blocked in the validation law, regularization law case. What happened there? I mean, except from the robbery, broad daylight of taking lands privately owned by Palestinians and handing it over to Jewish Israelis, and not just any Jewish Israelis, but those Jews who have trespassed into those lands. That was the idea of the validation law. except saying that this is unconstitutional, the court has also made it clear that under the paradigm of belligerent occupation, an occupier cannot even expropriate land for public use, for public interest, and every country, every state has expropriation laws for public use. In America, it's called public domain. You expropriate private land to build roads, you expropriate public lands to build a hospital, to build a new neighborhood. And under the occupation paradigm, the normative framework of the occupation paradigm does not allow the expropriation for public use if the public that is going to benefit from that are not the protected person, the people under occupation. And so for years, Israel has done many things to grab lands of Palestinians in order to expand the colonization project. But there were certain limitations on that. And these limitations were important. And one of them is exactly that. The court has ruled already in the 80s that expropriation of land, for example, to pave a new highway, is only possible if it will at least serve the Palestinians as well as the settlers. It cannot serve only settlers. Now, let's assume that annexation happens. That restriction, for example, is gone to the dustbin. Because if in the annexed territory there are privately owned lands that are privately owned by Palestinians, and those Palestinians are either reside in the annexed territory or outside the annexed territory, it is clear that the expropriation for public interest, the public is the Israelis who live there or the residents of the annexed territory. So if we have, for example, today an area, let's say in Ariel, one of the biggest settlements in the heart of the north of the West Bank, and they have a problem to expand because around them there are registered Palestinian private lands. And today, if they try to expropriate it, they have to engage in a project that would be also benefiting the Palestinians. And that is not something they want. The whole idea of a settlement is to be completely clean of Palestinians. And so after annexation, if some of those private lands are in the annexed territory, the expropriation can go ahead. And this time without the limitation that the goal of the expropriation is to benefit the Palestinians. So that's one thing that will change. Another thing that will change is that if Israel will implement and apply its laws, all the Israeli legislation from 72 years of Israeli parliament on the West Bank, on parts of the West Bank, one of those laws that will be applied to the annexed territories is the Absentee Property Act. The Absentee Property Act was legislated in 1950, and its purpose was to nationalize all the property of the Palestinian refugees from 1948. And basically that was one of the 2 or 3 laws that implemented Zionism together with the law of return. Now, if that law is being implemented on a new territory, that means that people who today are not considered to be absentees because their property is not in a place, in a territory, in an area that the law applies to, will suddenly become technically absentees. And if property, lands, but not only lands, but mainly lands, that are owned by Palestinian refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, or even in the West Bank, in parts of the West Bank that are not annexed, they will fictitiously, and technically, but legally, will become absentees. And then their land potentially will be nationalized. So the first thing that I want you to know is that annexation will bring with it a massive property expropriation. To be honest, I don't think there will be one single parcel, one single plot of private Palestinian land that would be left in the annexed territory in Palestinian hands. Because even if there will be places where expropriation for this reason or another would not take place, most likely that the owners would not have any access to these lands. This is now sovereign Israel in Israeli domestic law eyes. And in order to get there, you need a visa. And suddenly areas that were in reach, areas that Palestinian farmers could go to will suddenly not be accessible anymore. So that's one thing. The second thing that has to be understood is that we don't know what would be the parameters of the annexation. Eventually the model of the Trump plan, 30% of the West Bank, or something that is smaller in scale, maybe only settlement blocks close to, adjacent to the Green Line. But what we do know is that there are, and probably the lines would be drafted in such a way to include as much land as possible with as little number of Palestinians as possible. But some Palestinians would be caught in the annexed territories. And as Sawsan rightly said, Prime Minister Netanyahu made it clear that there is no intention of providing them with Israeli citizenship, and probably not even with Israeli permanent residency, as was done in East Jerusalem. And the excuse would be that they are subjects of the Palestinian Authority. So they don't need to have any status in Israel. And by the way, this is a complete replica, complete copy of the South African Bantustans, because also in South Africa during the apartheid, the white regime said we don't need to provide the black people with South African citizenship because they are citizens of these Bantu states, which are of course not states, not even close to being states. But anyway, these are people who will be caught in the annexed territory. Some of them, Israel recognized their lawful residency in these areas, but many communities, many Palestinian communities, mainly in the Jordan Valley, in South Mount Hebron and the Jerusalem envelope, are not recognized by Israel as lawful. Israel has always wanted these areas, the Jerusalem periphery, the Jordan Valley, and South Mount Hebron, which are scarcely populated. So Israel would not allow people to move there because the policy was that these are areas for future expansion of settlement. And so what we have there are small communities, hamlets, of unrecognized villages. And when they will become part of sovereign Israel after annexation, they will become illegal aliens in Israel. It's not just that they will not have a status. They will become illegal aliens. And think of Khan el-Ahmar or Susia, maybe you heard of these places in South Mount Hebron, Susia, and in the Jerusalem periphery, Khan el-Ahmar. These places where Israel wages real wars against these communities with the aim of displacing them, forcibly removing them from where they now reside. The tools that Israel uses are law and construction, planning and construction law. There is no legal prohibition on these people to be present in these places, but they're not given permission to build. And through zoning, planning, and construction, they are being driven away from these places. After annexation, it will no longer be just an issue of permits and construction. They will be outlaws. They will be people who are their actual presence in these areas are illegal. Now, how many are there like these? If the Jordan Valley, for example, is being annexed, Prime Minister Netanyahu was asked by the Sheldon Adelson pamphlet, Israel Hayom, 3 or 4 weeks ago in an interview, what will become of the Palestinians in the Jordan Valley? And he said, well, you know, there's Jericho. We're not going to annex Jericho. And then there are two groups of hamlets in the Jordan Valley, and they will be given a status in the PA. Will find a way they can live there under Israeli rule, but will be subjects of the PA. The problem here is that there are not 2 communities in the Jordan Valley except Jericho. There are almost 50. 50 small hamlets, including herding communities, Bedouins and others. And he mentioned only 2 because the government of Israel does not recognize the rest 47 or 48. And all of them will be under threat of displacement come annexation. So annexation is about expropriation of land and threat of displacement of enforced eviction of individuals, families, and communities. And this is something that has to be understood. This is one of the reasons we have to oppose annexation, in parallel to the fact that it is a gross violation, not just a gross violation of international, I'll take one more minute, not just a gross violation of international, it's a breach of one of the most fundamental prohibitions of the new world legal order of the post-Second World War. Because in 1945, when humanity came out from the Second World War and decided to make a big change and created the United Nations and signed the UN Charter, it was the first time in human history that a prohibition on use of force was anchored as a legal binding principle. And that principle is anchored even and cemented through the prohibition on annexation of lands, because a world that allows an occupier to annex territory is a world that incentivizes wars of aggression. Only a world that does not recognize and would not allow annexations that are not a product of an agreement and negotiations. Only a world that does not recognize annexations is a world that is pushing the countries to solve their disputes in a peaceful manner. And so in 75 years since 1945, the international community has not recognized a single unilateral annexation, not in East Jerusalem, not in the Golan Heights, not Western Sahara by Morocco, not even the Crimea by the Russians. And the EU, as you all know, has imposed sanctions on Crimea and Russia. And not, by the way, it's not the first time that the West Bank is being annexed. The West Bank was illegally annexed by Jordan in 1950, and the international community did not recognize it. And in fact, Jordan was almost expelled from the Arab League for doing so. So this is far more dangerous than just for the Israeli-Palestinian or even the Israeli-Arab conflict. It's a question, the way the international community will react to this challenge that Israel is now creating will affect other conflicts in other places.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much for this assessment. And you already touched on another question that I have here on my paper. Can I ask you to maybe check your microphone, because I have the feeling this we could hear Sawsan much clearer than you. While I go with the next question to Sawsan concerning public opinion in Israel in connection with the announced annexation plans. As far as I understand it, there have been numerous polls with different results in terms of how people see that. But it seems that the overall concerns of people in Israel are the economic situation following the corona pandemic, and the corona pandemic itself, especially with the increased numbers of infection in the last weeks. So can you give us an assessment on the public opinion, on the mood in Israel, and also differentiate between the Jewish part of Israel and the Palestinian part of Israel? Please put your microphone.
Yeah. As you said, we need to have a distinction between the public opinion in Jewish society and Palestinian society inside of Israel, Palestinian citizens inside of Israel. I think that even though we hear some opposition to the annexation among the Israeli Jewish public for the annexation, but by and large, the public opinion among the Israelis, the Jewish Israelis, of course, I mean, basically is not that interested to basically publicly oppose it, because from their perspective, the annexation has been happening in different ways, de facto, for a long time. The right wing as well impact and influence on the public opinion is being more and more stronger, which is leading to also a higher support among the Israelis for the annexation plan. But I think the more interesting, from my perspective as a Palestinian citizen, inside of Israel, is what the Palestinians basically, what is the attitude of the Palestinians inside of Israel, because and it's not being talked about a lot, because in this big Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all the time the focus is on the Palestinians in the West Bank, or the Palestinian Authority, of course, the representatives of the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but the stand or the perspective of Palestinian citizens of Israel has not been on the spot on this issue. And this should not be the case, because the Palestinian citizens in Israel see themselves as part of the Palestinian people, which is in the 1948, 67, includes, of course, West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinian refugees in all over other that are residing now in all over the countries. And the fact that the annexation might happen puts us as well in a lot of questions, because if the annexation will lead to classification, of course, before I continue, just to make it clear that Palestinian citizens in Israel oppose the annexation. And this is also the perspective and the stand of the joint list, the Arab MKs in the Knesset, which all oppose the annexation, and also say that it cannot be unilateral, that this is an illegal move, and gross violation of international law, and that it will have a huge and dangerous impact on Palestinians, but also on the Israelis. And the Palestinian citizens in Israel follow this stand. We follow it also because we know that the classification in the status of Palestinians, where it will be clear that under the sovereignty of Israel, if it will apply on the West Bank, you will have different classifications. You will have Palestinians, citizens of Israel with citizenship, but is basically conditioned. It's second or third class citizens. It's basically under a legal regime that has the Jewish nation state law, which is a basic law that excluded as well the citizenry of the Palestinians inside of Israel. And then you will have the Palestinians who are on the one hand subjects of the Palestinian Authority, but under the sovereignty of the Israelis in those parts that will be annexed. You'll have also the Palestinians that will be in the territory that will not be annexed, but will still, of course, have the status of being protected persons under international law and subject to the PA. And of course, you will have the Gazans who have been in blockade for 12, 13 years from now. This classification strengthens the perspective towards all Palestinians as enemy, aliens, and strengthens this doctrine of enemy alien doctrine towards the Palestinians, viewing all Palestinians as enemies. Now, this will affect a lot of things in reality if, of course, things will happen. Because what will happen with the right to movement, for example, or freedom of movement for Palestinians who will be in the territory that will be annexed, considering that, for example, today laws exist, just to give you an example, laws exist that prohibits the entry of Palestinians to Israel for the purpose of family unification. So what will happen with this connection, with the family connection, with the social connection, with the economic and cultural connection between those groups that all will be under the Israeli sovereignty, yet each of them is being seen as a separate enemy group and disconnected geographically from each other. Like these issues are in mind. So the opposition is not just because the annexation is illegal. It's also because we are against imposing a unilateral annexation by Israel, which will block the solution of two-state solution, which in any case, in today's reality is also not that strong, because settlements are all over the West Bank and the facts are stronger from any other demand for a state. But it will also, again, I'll get back to my point of self-determination. What will happen with the right to self-determination of Palestinians in all these that will be fragmentized under Israeli sovereignty? So the issue of the fear of immediate displacement that Michael was talking about is an indeed imminent threat to Palestinians, which of course concerns us, because the same fear that the Palestinians in the West Bank are having from displacement, which basically might lead to transfer, might lead to forced eviction, maybe outside of the Palestinian territories. This is the same fear that we have as Palestinian citizens all the time being afraid of, even though we have citizenship in Israel. The demand, for example, loyalty by Palestinian citizens in Israel to the Jewish state or to the political perspective of the Israeli majority, and if you're not loyal, if you are not in the same line, it will lead for stripping citizenship. And we just had a hearing about it yesterday in the Israeli Supreme Court. This is the same basically fear, even if it is on different level. So there are a lot of mutual fears, even though annexation will not directly affect us, but this is something also that we are fearing of for the future and the right to self-determination for all Palestinians, not only those in the West Bank or not only those inside of Israel.
Thank you very much, Sawsan. We have about a quarter of an hour to go. Time is running, and so I would like to come to another aspect, which is the international responses. And I would like to ask Michael, there have been a wide range of protests against the annexation plans by heads of states, by governments, by members of parliament, UN experts, by civil society organizations, and just today a letter by 1,080 parliamentarians from European countries that spoke out against the annexation plans has been published. And I wanted to ask you if you think that all these protests might have an effect on one side, or the effect will be limited if you look at the answer that the European High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, gave when he was asked if it would be the same situation with the Russian annexation of Crimea, if Israel would annex parts of the West Bank, and his answer was there is a difference between annexing territory that belongs to a sovereign state and that of the Palestinians. So how do you see the international reactions? Do you think it will have an effect, and do you think there should be more?
So we need first to know that all the polls that are conducted in Israel show that there is a majority that objects annexation. The majority is much smaller than before because there was never a majority that was supporting annexation in Israel, never. But throughout the years, in the last decade of Netanyahu's reign, that majority became smaller and smaller. And I think the last poll that I saw was 55% opposed annexation and about 35 support it, and the others don't know. The question, the only reason that the Israeli public is split and there's not a landslide opposition to annexation is because of the position of America. Because we have this bully big brother who's now driving us, pushing us to do that, or at least has been. We don't know what's their position now. Maybe they have cooled off a little. I don't know. I'm not a political expert. I definitely cannot envisage and understand the rationale between things Trump is doing. But so when the annexation stormed into our life as a real option, it was only several weeks ago, a couple of months ago, because for 50-something years it was clear that this is not a non-starter. This is not something that the international community will ever allow us to do. And suddenly, with this Trump plan, even before the Trump plan, Netanyahu announced in the second election cycle that he's planning to annex the Jordan Valley, and that was seen as an election stunt. No one took it seriously. But then the Trump plan came, and suddenly it became serious. But then we did not have a public debate on it because immediately coronavirus pandemic began, and there was no talk about anything but the virus. So in practice, only in the last couple of weeks has the Israeli public began seriously dealing, not seriously enough, but the media and the journalists have begun to address that issue. And one of the most important things that this public debate can provide is for the Israelis to understand the costs of annexation. I mean, I would love Israelis to decide that annexation should be opposed because this is immoral, because there are people on the other side that would be trumped, that would lose their property, that would lose their right to self-determination, that they have right to pursue their happiness and their way of life by themselves. I would love that to happen, but I understand that hegemony, nowhere has hegemony just waived its privileges because it's not nice. So at least the Israelis should know what the costs are. And one of the main components of the costs is the international reaction. And I have to say that even though I would expect a much harsher, much clearer reaction with serious, with explanation of the serious consequences on commerce, on many things, on cooperation with Israel, in academic spheres, in scientific spheres, and that has happened very, very partially. Still, the pressure is mounting, and I think Borrell's reply was misfortunate because in legal terms, there is no difference between annexing the Crimea and taking it away from the Ukraine and annexing parts of the West Bank. In both cases, the reason why it's wrong is because this violates the sovereignty of another nation. And the question of whether that nation, that sovereignty was independent and free when annexation came, or whether it was not free and under occupation when annexation came, is not material to the wrongfulness of the annexation. So that answer was problematic, and I think Borrell understands that. And I think the reason he said that is because he needs to say something to explain the inconsistency of the EU when it comes to how it addressed and how it reacted to the Crimea annexation and how it will react to the OPT annexation. And since I'm talking to NIF in Germany, I have to say, the biggest blocker state is Germany. And we understand the history, and we understand why for Germany it's really complicated, both even probably impossible to say that we will treat Israel the same way we treat Russia when they do the same things. But under international law, in international law terms, there's no difference whatsoever. And if the EU and Germany as a central member state is serious about being the power that raises the banner of international law, and that's what the EU is all about, and that is what Germany is all about since 1945. Then, even when it's hard and even when it's complicated, it has to say there are things that are not allowed, that even our biggest allies and are not allowed to do. And the consistency here is important, because if we will get away with annexation, what will Putin say? You will have a very, very good argument to say this is completely unfair. Now, the last thing I want to say about your question is that we have to take into account the possibility that eventually the annexation bid that Netanyahu will pursue will not be the full-scale 30% of the West Bank Trump planned annexation, but a smaller scale one. And that smaller scale will happen without, of course, him declaring end of claims. No, he will say this is the first step. And so it is crucial how the international community will react to that first step, because there will be other steps along the way. And if the world wants Israelis to understand that this is not acceptable, it has to do it like with children. Like with children, you have to be consistent. You have to make it clear what's wrong and what's right. Children learn. I hope states too.
Thank you very much. We have 8 minutes to go, and I have 2 questions more to address with the request for a small, short answer. First of all, the question of reversibility. As far as I understand it, annexation can be voted in the Knesset with a simple majority, but the ceding of land would need the approval of a 2/3 majority. So does that mean that any annexation step that is done is basically irreversible? That's the first question. And second question, maybe just with a yes or no, do you think that the demand for a 2-state solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which plays a prominent role in this letter that I mentioned by the 1,080 parliamentarians from European countries, do you think that this demand should still be kept up despite the situation on the ground?
I think I didn't hear clearly the second question, sorry.
The second question was just, should the demand for a 2-state solution still be kept up politically? Sawsan, can you start?
Yeah, I'll take one, maybe I'll take the second question, and Michael, if you want to elaborate on the first. I think that as long as the PA still holds on with the demand for 2-state solution, despite all difficulties that arise from the facts on the ground, the international community's demand should go in line with what the PA demands. Again, international community cannot have demands that are in disagreement of the PA, because it will be another unilateral step even though if it's against the annexation, but it's again basically having a demand or a step that is not taking the agreement or the agreement of the Palestinians. So the start should be what the Palestinians want, what they demand. If they're continuing to add and demand a continuation of a two-state solution, even if it's difficult to implement that in reality, this also should be the demand and respect the demand by the international community.
So I will just add to what Sawsan said, that we need a permanent agreement, a solution that would ensure that all the people living between the Jordan River and the sea have real citizenship in a real country, in a real state, not in a PA, not in an authority, not in an entity, not in an autonomy, but in a real state, because citizenship is the guardian of basic human rights. Now, how do you get to this? The people between the Jordan River and the sea, they express exactly what they want. They want two states. That's what I see. I don't see now a huge movement towards one state or any other type and they will be the ones who decide in what form. But it has to be a model that ensures the rights of all the people. And now the Palestinians want a state of their own, a nation state, and Israelis too. As for your second question, it's true that the Israeli law at the moment prescribes that there's a need for 80 members of the Knesset in order to secede land, or a referendum, 61 vote and a referendum. That is the option. But that law can be repealed with a simple majority. It's not immune. So basically, instead of one vote, you need two votes. So if we have a 61 majority in the parliament to secede land, basically that majority can do it. To be honest, I don't think that any secession from lands could happen not in the framework of a full, big agreement, peace agreement. So if annexation happens, I don't think we could roll it back until we have a full-scale peace agreement or some kind of a peace solution. It won't happen before that. So if, and Netanyahu knows it. He knows that this window of opportunities until November, before the elections in America, if he manages to annex lands, then even if Trump loses in November, and even if Biden would take a firmer stand, which he doesn't, but a firmer stand against annexation, he will not be able to demand rolling the annexation back without a political solution to the conflict.
Just if I may add to what Michael was just saying about the majority in the law, that of course that's in case they pass it in a regular law. If they decide to pass it in a basic law and set their a higher majority to change the basic law, which is also another realistic option, because basic law would be also more, I think, more relevant for the Israelis in order to bypass or to make it more difficult for the Supreme Court to have a judicial review in case it will, the constitutionality of it will be challenged. So again, I think that it also it depends a lot on whether they will adopt the path of a law or a basic law, and things will be determined by that.
Okay, thank you so much. We have 1 minute to go, which gives me a chance to thank you very, very much for joining us, for giving us your analysis, your assessments, and your insights. I think even though we did not touch even half of the questions that I have written down here, I think we touched upon the most important ones, and I think our audience did get some new information and insights in order to understand this, on one side very complex, on the other side quite easy situation. And I am very thankful that you also pointed out that the whole issue is not just an issue that concerns Israelis and Palestinians, but that it has profound effects on the question of the international order that arose out of World War II. And that means that all the members of this order do also have a responsibility concerning this issue that we were talking about here. And with that, I would like to say goodbye to our audience and thank you very much again for joining us and for your interest in the issue. Michael and Sawsan, you can stay for a couple of more minutes if you want to. And thanks again for the audience for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.